Hello, I'm Heather Fogarty, and my presentation is Not a Hopeless Blur of Symbols, Reading Disabilities and a Few Strategies for Supporting Students with Reading Disabilities. So reading disabilities are really tough when people have them, and it's a challenge that oftentimes they face throughout their lives. But as the title suggests, it's not completely hopeless. There are some different things that you can do to help support children and people in general that have reading disabilities. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So there are several different types of reading disabilities. Phonological, it's probably the most important. The processing speed or orthographic processing deficit, and comprehension deficit, and attention deficit hyperactive disorder. Well, technically that's not a reading disability, but it can kind of look like one and cause a lot of the same problems as the regular reading disabilities do. So I'll talk about ADHD here, especially since there's some strategies that help children with other reading disabilities also help children with ADHD learn to read better and understand things better. So phonological disabilities. Phonological disabilities are the most important disabilities. They're the biggest umbrella, and they're really the most basic and the hardest to really get over when you have them. Phonological disabilities has to do with phonemes and the letters that represent them. Phoneme is the most basic unit of sound in a language. And usually a single letter codes for a phoneme, though not always. Sometimes groups of letters, like diphthongs, code for a phoneme. And there are people that they just have a very hard time connecting the letters to the sounds that they represent. Which none of the articles that I read specifically mentioned this, but I extrapolated for myself from that that could be part of concrete operational thinking is one of the reasons that children have such a hard time sometimes with really getting the phonemes and learning how to spell and learning to sound out words, is because sometimes when you're in that stage of life, you need very concrete things. And while written language isn't concrete, it's a symbol that represents something. Like I say the word cat, and it's not on this page, but you know exactly what it means. I use it to represent a cat, but in and of itself, you can just hear the sound cat. Well, if I write out the word cat, this is a symbolic representation of the sounds that I just said, k, a, t, right? And so children that have a hard time with abstract thinking are going to have a harder time making the connection between all these weird squiggly lines on the page and the sounds and meaning that they represent. And having a phonological disability also transfers, meaning that later on in life, if you don't get that phonological connection down as a child, that makes everything else more difficult to read later on. And strategies used to help children make the phonological connection between sounds and letters also helps them out for a very long time if it's consistent and well done. They also transfer to the other types of reading. So not being able to make that basic phonological connection also affects your processing speed or orthographic processing deficit, and also affects your ability to comprehend all of what you're reading, which it kind of makes sense. If you can't sound the word out on a basic level and figure out the word that all those squiggly lines represent, then you're not going to be able to read the word accurately. Then you're going to be so focused on sounding out individual words that all the the words in a sentence are going to get lost and you're not going to make the connection to the sentence, or it's going to be very difficult for you to really work out the meaning of a sentence by piecing together all of those individual meanings, and then the sentences sort of get lost in the paragraphs and in the longer passages that you're reading if you can't get that basic concept of this letter stands for this sound. And dyslexia also falls under this big, broad umbrella term of a phonological disability. I looked it up really quickly on Merriam-Webster.com, and dyslexia is a little bit fuzzy. It can refer to a lot of different things. I didn't read an article that really specifically defined it for me. And basically, it's a phonological disorder. I've heard it described in different ways. Basically, people having trouble figuring out what the different letters stand for and what they mean. So the processing speed and orthographic processing deficit is basically the kid can figure out what they're reading, but it takes a very long time. So they're accurate, but they're slow, and it just again makes it more difficult to understand things. You can puzzle out the meanings of the word, but it takes you so long to figure out what all the words mean that you've forgotten the first word of the sentence by the time you get to the end of it. So comprehension deficit is basically a person can read, but they're missing the overall meaning of the passage that they've read. Somewhere there's a disconnect. They can't remember the order that the storyline happened in. They can't identify the cause and effect of different events in the story and things like that. They can read, but they're just not getting everything that's happening. So as the title implies, reading disabilities are not just a hopeless muck that people have to swim in their entire lives. There's some different strategies that you can employ to help them. So what's not the best? Using colors, such as a colored background. Red in particular grabs our attention and helps us focus on things. So red in the background of text, images, pretty pictures. Everybody loves to look at pictures while we're reading something. And music and other sounds. Although these can help children with ADHD in the short run because it gives them extra sensory stimuli to just help them focus on what they're looking at. The problem with this is that they habituate to these stimuli a lot quicker than other people, and so what grabs their attention at first they just kind of get used to after a while, and then it doesn't really help them read things anymore. But so you're probably thinking, great, thanks Heather, that's not very helpful. Well, if you need a quick attention getter to help students engage in the short run, this can really help you out. These colors, images, music, and sounds can help you out for that. It's just not a very good long-term strategy. And it can help motivate as well. Feel more motivated to read the story so you can figure out what that cool picture's about, and music makes everything a little bit cooler. But it's not going to really help with that reading comprehension skill in the long run. So the things I just discussed are different types of novelty. There are other types of novelty that you can use that they have done studies on that can actually help improve students' reading. And if you're not planning on going into English, or you're not planning on teaching elementary, or if you're not planning on teaching at all, you're probably tempted to just start tuning me out. But you shouldn't, because this still applies to you if you're in a teaching field or if you plan on having children of your own. This is stuff that you can employ to help your own kids or to help kids in other areas, because for some reason children with reading disabilities also have trouble with the positive negative signs and that sort of thing in math as well, and you use reading really in every field. a kid is going to have to at some point crack open a science textbook or a math textbook, especially if they go on to college, but really any class. There's reading involved in every subject. But novelty in a storyline is what can really help motivate students to read. And think about it. If the storyline is boring, you're going to get bored. You're not motivated to read the entire thing. And so you're going to stop doing all that hard work, sounding out all the words, putting the words together in a sentence and trying to extract the meaning from it. But if the story, instead of about a man whose, bank account is at zero and he has all these adult problems, or he's walking down the street picking up leaves for his neighbor, doing something sort of everyday and boring, if he's not doing that but instead suddenly gets attacked by a dragon on the way home, that's more exciting, right? Kids are going to want to read more about that. So something you can do is you can take a familiar storyline and give it a little bit of a fresh twist, or replace a few words with things that we're not really used to looking at all that much. So, for example, say there's a cat in the original story. You replace that with a tarantula. That's already more interesting. Kids are already going to be more motivated to really work to sound out those words and figure out what's going on in the story. You can also use different adjectives, nouns, and verbs. Use action verbs instead of passive verbs. Those are more interesting and more novel. And also make them more vivid words. So instead of just, he walked across the room, but he sprinted across the room, is a little bit more novel. It's going to catch their attention more. And they've tested it, and it also, not only does it help just with individual words and individual small passages, but it helps with comprehension of a larger passage. You also want to find things that avoid excessive description, especially for kids with ADHD, as they have this distraction from the main meaning and the main plot of the text, or there's just too much description and they just really get bored and have a hard time really getting through that. Especially in the elementary years, mainly what you want to work on is their comprehension and their reading ability, and they can learn to focus when they're older, for themselves. Crack open something boring and persevere through that. Right now, what we're talking about when you're developing those basic reading skills, excessive description is something good to avoid because you need to really keep their attention. Another really big thing that you can do to help children with reading disabilities is phoneme training. The article that I read didn't go into depth of what this would actually look like, but it has to do with really stressing the different sounds that make up the word, so that children can start differentiating between the different sounds and realizing that different letters stand for different sounds, and that you then, again, kind of sound like a broken record, but put those letters together is putting those sounds together to create the words that they already know how to say. And this phoneme training, they've done studies on that they start in preschool, okay, before they even have looked at words, just bringing that awareness that a word is made up of more than one basic unit of sound. And then when they have that extra phoneme training, the intensity of bringing the definition to the different sounds and stuff, a little extra time a week for several years can really help them later on. It really improved their reading and comprehension scores. So I think that's about it for tonight. I hope you learned something, and hopefully reading disabilities don't look so